Hi all, and welcome to Chess News number 56. I'm Waldemar Moes, your host and chess trainer. So, for today's video, I have decided to analyze a game with one of the openings that I'm interested in of late, the Queen Pawns openings. So, openings such as the Colle, the Torre, the London system, the Trompowsky, and so on. And it's one of the games that has been played during the Isle of Man chess tournament between Lawrence Trent and Jonathan Grant. Okay, now normally before I analyze a game, I upload the game to leechess.org, where they have a very nice feature. They have this tool where you can import a PGN file and then also request an engine analysis of the game. And then they can show you in a graph on a move-by-move basis what the evaluation of the position is according to the engine throughout the course of the game. Now, what struck me when I saw the graph being plotted is that the graph never went below the zero baseline. That means white was never really in any serious danger. As a matter of fact, white won this game and the evaluations were almost all of the time above zero. But what struck me is that during two moments in the game there was a sudden peak in the evaluation in white's favor. But the evaluation didn't stay at the level of the peak but dropped back. Hey, otherwise it wouldn't be a peak, right? But that made me wonder, did white not take his chances there on two occasions? Well, let's see if we can try and find out that by analyzing today's feature game. So, Lawrence Trent with the white pieces opened up with d4, and Jonathan Grant, his opponent, defended with knight f6. So here, bishop g5 was played, the Trompowsky attack. Now, in my opinion, the best way to reply against the Trompowsky is by playing knight e4, which hits the bishop on g5 and does not self-pin the knight as does the move e6, which was played in the game. Already, black is in danger of very slowly drifting into favorable queen pawn positions for white. Now, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with the move e6, but there is already this danger by self-pinning the knight that white gets into the positions that he would really like to play. Okay, now white can play a real Trompowsky here with e4, when h6 really prompts white to surrender with the bishop pair, because he cannot go bishop h4 here, since after g5, bishop g3, he loses the pawn on e4. So after h6, he would have to surrender the bishop pair, and then queen takes f6 leads to an independent Trompowsky position. But after e6, Lawrence Trent played knight d2, and this is really the signal for a Torre attack opening. Okay. Now here as well, black could try h6, but now chasing the bishop with g5 doesn't really make, g5 doesn't really make any sense, because knight e4 is no longer possible, because white, in playing knight d3 on the third move, had already overprotected the e4 square. Terribly sorry. Cheers, Waldemar. Of course, this would lose the knight to knight takes h4. So instead of chasing the bishop after h6, it makes much more sense to play c5 and then play according to the lines of Ivanchuk-Carlsen. Now note how Carlsen played against Ivanchuk in 2009 and how he chose this particular defensive setup against white's moves, which are very similar to the ones in our feature game. What I notice is here, for instance, this early queenside fianchetto, and now after bishop d3, bishop b7 castles, not d5 as we will see in our feature game, but rather d6. Now the big difference here is that with the pawn on d6, black is not relinquishing control of e5, which is normally an important springboard for the white knight, but also that he does not block in his own light squared bishop along the long diagonal. Okay, so please compare Evancho Carlsen for a very decent way to combat the white setup. It's more of a flexible hedgehog position where black just decides to develop his game along his first 3 ranks instead of putting anything on the 4th rank. Okay, back to the game where after knight d2 c5 was played, so similar as in the Evancho Carlsen game. And now we saw some typical queen pawn moves, e3, knight c6, knight gf3, and now d5. I feel that unless he knows very well what he's doing with this move, black slides into an uncomfortable queen's pawn position. The problem with the pawn on d5 is always the passivity of the light squared bishop and also the relinquished control of the e5 square. It allows white for rather straightforward attacking play on the king side later on. So we saw c3, h6. Now black's moves are not necessarily mistakes, but they do have consequences. This move, for instance, later presents a hook for white to use for a g-pawn break. We can imagine white playing g4, g5, trying to open up the g file. And also a hook for a possible bishop sacrifice, as we will see later on in the game. We can imagine white playing bishop h4, g3, f4, and only later when he's ready and when black has castled, sacrifice the bishop on h6 to pry open black's kingside position. And last but not least, it also weakens the g6 square, allowing for possible sacrifices on this square later on. Okay, we saw bishop g4, h4. Of course, white had to save the bishop, bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, and now also the address of the black king is known. He won't be moving from that area anytime soon. So now it's really clear that white can start aiming for an attack on that side of the board. White also castles, and b6 was played. Now, according to the statistics on Lichess, white already scores around 62% from this position, and that must say something about the practicality of black's position, which is probably lower than in many other lines of queen pawns openings or other openings for that matter. Knight e5, the first typical attacking maneuver. Now bishop b7 would have been possible, but that would also allow for such strengthening moves such as f4 or bishop g3, or maybe the other knight coming around to f3. So instead of bishop b7, black opts here for a more principled way of playing. Knight takes e5, forcing the recapture d takes e5. Now I say more principled way of playing because with this exchange, black somewhat damages white's pawn structure. Most notably, the pawn on e5, even though it is a space gaining move and is attacking the black knight on f6, we could say it's a wedge pawn, the pawn also in and of itself is a weakness. It is no longer protected by the pawns that were sitting here. It had to, make itself separate from the pawn chain, and therefore it becomes a target for black's pieces. So there is some structural damage. Now this doesn't mean that white is going to lose the game. It only means that he has to compensate this structural damage with rather quick and incisive middle game play. Because for the moment he still has the initiative. He's the one attacking the knight. He's the one that can build up some pressure on the king side. And so fortunately for him, the gods between the opening and the late middle game or end game, they have played the early middle game. They have placed, I want to say rather, the early middle game. This is where white needs to play very precisely. Well, here comes the first attack on the pawn. Knight d7, of course, the knight is no longer sitting on its natural defensive square, so black's king is starting to feel slightly more drafty already. But for the moment, the pawn on e5 is in danger. Now there are two ways to play here, because let's not forget, it's not just the pawn, by the way, that black's attacking. He's also attacking the loose bishop on h4, right? So there are two ways to play. First, there is the positional way. Bishop takes bishop, exchanging of white's so-called bad bishop for black's good bishop, and then fortifying with f4, and after c4 and bishop c2. This also scores quite well statistically for white, but it's a clearly more positional way of playing. Black will also have his chances because there are some problems in white's position as well, right? Okay. However, in the game, after knight d7, Trent plays in a completely different way, and I like his move more. As far as I know, he's always been more of an attacking player, and I think it would also be my personal preference if I were ever to end up in this particular position, to play bishop g3. Now that saves the bishop, but also simultaneously, of course, protects the weakness on e5. And in sidestepping the exchange of the bishops, white also keeps more pieces on the board, and this is always good if you want to develop an attack. Then you simply have more attacking power. And as mentioned before, one very important idea could be to bring the bishop here and then prepare a bishop sacrifice on h6. Well, if you're going to exchange bishops, you will never be able to sacrifice your bishop on h6, right? Okay, so, but black may have been thinking, this pawn on e5, it's a weakness. What happens if I attack it for a second time? Queen c7. Now, even though this sounds logical, right? Why not attack something if you can attack something? You have a target on e5. It does place the queen in the line of fire of the bishop. But for the moment, black may have been thinking, well, how is white going to defend that? Well, white defended by means of queen h5. Now there are two defenders, right? Two defenders and two attackers. So we could say attack and defense are in balance, but that does not mean that the pawn is safe. There only needs to happen something and the balance can be disturbed, right? So maybe black was also thinking along the lines of, but what happens now if I try to eliminate one of the defenders of the pawn on e5? For instance, g6. Where does the white queen go? Can the queen still protect the e5 pawn? No, she cannot. But here we see one of the consequences of the earlier h7, h6. g6 is of course a blunder. Bishop takes g6 would immediately win the game. Okay, well then you say, of course not g6. Come on, Waldemar, we all know about bishop takes d6. Don't suggest any ridiculous moves. Well, then let me suggest f5. Doesn't this also block the defense from the queen towards the pawn? Yes, but hey, there's this en passant rule in chess, right? And now we're attacking your queen. Okay, and we're also attacking your bishop. So aren't you losing? No, black is not losing because he recaptures the pawn with a counter attack of equal strength, because he's also attacking now white's queen. But it turns out that instead of bishop takes queen and knight takes queen, when black can look forward to the future with some optimism, white will play queen e2. And now, after shielding the queen with bishop d6 and an exchange on d6, white plays e4, threatening e5, and he maintains quite a nice initiative, most notably because with playing f5 and h7, h6, black has weakened his light squares around his queen quite seriously. And black can also not really take on e4, because then he would also be messing up his own pawn structure even more, leaving him with another serious light squared weakness on e6. So here I would clearly prefer to play white. So Even though after queen c7 black may have been thinking that he was somehow playing very precise, immediately pouncing on the e5 weakness, I don't really like in hindsight this queen move so much, because white has the good defense with queen h5, and queen h5 does bring the all-important attacking piece, the queen, towards the king side where she needs to be. No king side attack is ever possible normally without the queen being present. Okay, well, so no g6, no f5 was played after all in the game, rather bishop b7 was played. Black continues with his normal development. And now white played knight f3. I'm not so sure about this move. To me it's not absolutely clear that the knight belongs on f3 here and now. It does, however, for the moment stop any central pushes by black. And by that I mean either c4 or d4. Because d4 is controlled sufficiently by whites to win that pawn. And c4 would leave an enormous hole on d4 for the white knight, completely justifying the position of that knight on f3. So, hey, you have to play something. But alternatives were, for instance, to play f4 or rook a1, similar to what happened later in the game. But we go with the game, knight f3, and now black did play one of the central pushes. He did play c4. And I think this is the first really mistake, or the first real mistake in the game. But it also sort of shows the problems that black is facing. How to create any counterplay in the center and or the queen side. And when playing against the king side attack, these plans on the queen side or in the center normally come quite a bit too late. I do understand that black creates a route for his knight to go to c5 and later d3 or e4, but it also completely justifies white's knight f3 as mentioned before. White now, I think, has a clear advantage. Probably a better idea would have been to play something like a5, possibly even intending to play bishop a6, hopefully trying to exchange off this all-important attacking light squared bishop, which white definitely needs for a successful kingside attack. Okay, back to the game, where after c4, of course, white saved his bishop with bishop c2. Now knight c5 came, preparing to jump into either d3 or e4, so as to always be able to block this important attacking diagonal as some sort of an emergency break. But now white jumped into his stronghold on d4, and queen d7 was played. A very difficult position to play for black. Where and how is white coming for him, Is white maybe preparing f4, f5? Should I reckon with that? Or is white preparing this type of sacrifice, as mentioned before? Or is white maybe going for bishop f4, king h1, rook h1, g4, g5? I mean, that's already 3 or 4 attacking schemes that you somehow have to reckon with, and it's very difficult to see everything coming in advance and prepare for it. So how to position yourself defensively, right? Well, I think that maybe in all those attacks, this piece plays an important role. So one idea to try and confuse white would have been to play knight d3. Now it would be a little bit weak for white to trade off his beautiful bishop, even though it appears that he's going to win a pawn now for it, right? But hey, not so fast. After queen c4 we're defending the pawn, and without white's light square bishop things are not so clear. So then, after knight d3, white is well advised to just protect the pawn on b2 with rook b1. But now white has been slowed down a little bit. Black can try a5. And now the other idea of sacrificing the dark square bishop on h6 is also not possible, because now the knight takes that bishop, right? Also taking away a very important attacking piece from white. Okay, so I think that may have been a better practical option. In the game, Jonathan Grant played queen d7, and here came bishop f4, a very dangerous idea. White now puts the idea of a bishop sacrifice on h6 in black's mind to deal with on each and every move from now on. This is one of the reasons Trent did not exchange this bishop earlier on e7. He wants to attack. For the moment though, black can always interpose his knight on the b1 h7 diagonal after such a sacrifice, right? Well, let's consider quickly the consequences of such a sacrifice. The idea is to take, and then when we take the bishop, we get a second pawn for the exchange, for the sacrifice, for the bishop I should say, but we're already threatening checkmate with queen h7, and it would not really make any sense for black at that particular moment to move away the rook to make space for the king, because still queen h7, h8 would lead to a checkmate, because there is also no escape route via e7 anymore. These pieces are just clogging up black's safe route towards the center and the queen side. So in order to be able to defend after the sacrifice with white's knight appearing on h6 and threatening to go to h7, black wants to be able to interpose the supporting bishop by playing knight d3 or knight e4. So that's the idea. Okay, so everything's still fine, right? After bishop f4, black played rook f c1. An understandable move, already moving away from the king side, giving the black king a little bit more breathing space. Also, you know, just piling down the c file where he has some space advantage on the queen side. But apparently this move is an error. I say apparently because the engine goes a bit wild from here and shows +3 for white. Now why? This is the first peak in the engine evaluation that we saw, or that I saw rather, when I requested this analysis on leadchess.org. Apparently at this point in time, white could have won the game with bishop takes h6 after all. This sacrifice would have worked immediately. Let's see. Bishop takes h6. Pawn takes, queen takes, and several mating threats here. Now let's see if we can defend. The tricky thing here, especially when you're analyzing such a sacrifice, is that there are several defensive tries. There's bishop d8, creating an e7 flight square for the king. There is f5, blocking the diagonal. There's also knight d3 blocking the diagonal, and knight e4 blocking the diagonal. Now, intuitively, you should go with what you think is for your opponent the best possible defense. Because if that possible defense, that best possible defense already refutes your attack, then you don't have to analyze all the other defensive tries as well. Now this is a pitfall, that you start analyzing the other ones, losing valuable clock time, and you see that maybe the other defensive tries, they all work out well for your attack, but then you come to the best defense, and then you'll have to decide, oh, maybe it's not so clear after all, and then you get confused and you're already 10, 15, 20 minutes down on the clock. So please, 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 if you're in such a situation, try and realize that you're in this kind of situation. Be honest and complete with yourself and try and analyze what you think is the very best defensive move for your opponent. So in this case, instinctively, I think it would be knight e4. Now why? The knight was put on c5 to block the bishop, right? We also put the knight on a more central square. It is better than on d3 because it is closer towards the king side, and it also controls the g5 square from where white could possibly give a time gaining check, and on g5 it also cooperates with the bishop. So these are very strong indications that knight e4 might very well be the strongest defense here. And then you go analyzing, and then you don't find anything for white, unless you're a computer and you can spot science fiction moves. Because according to the engine, white still is winning here with the absolutely incredible and ununderstandable, non-human queen h5. Now, to understand why this move wins, we have to take a look at the normal and direct approach first. If the knight is blocking the diagonal of the bishop, then why don't we just kick the knight away, right? f3. Doesn't that just at least regain the piece? And don't we just get to keep our attack on top of it? No, because here comes a counter-attack and black is first. There is bishop g5 hitting the queen. Bishop e3 check hitting the king. Knight f2 check. And now after the forced exchange sacrifice, white unfortunately has nothing better than a draw by perpetual. Something along the lines of queen g5, king, check, king, check. And both sides have to repeat moves. Because here, if you try and play for the win, the black king will escape towards the queen side. Aha. Now, I'm not going to bore you with the complete precise play then after queen h5, but the big difference, the difference that I will point out to you after bishop takes h6, pawn takes, queen takes knight e4, and queen h5, is that first you sidestep the attack by the bishop on your queen, and only now do you want to play f3. And then you will get into a winning complex of variations. But, of course, all of this is way too difficult and unpractical for a human chess player to try and figure out. So I really like Trent's move in the game where he did not sacrifice the bishop after rook c8, but instead played rook a to d1. With this rook move, white prepares for the battle of the b1 h7 diagonal by already controlling the d3 square one more time, which is one of the important blocking squares for the knight. The other important square is of course going to be the e4 square, but white can always sooner or later contest that square with f3. So it's those two squares that sides are battling over right now. So let's see how the game continued. Rook a1 was played, and now queen e8. I would say black's queen is not a happy camper in this game. She first went here, then here, and then here. And it's clear to me that black is still searching for some sort of defensive setup. And quite frankly, it's just very difficult to try and figure that out. However, I think there was a clearly better defensive idea for the moment at least. He could also have played bishop f8 over protecting h6. And that would have made white's task a lot harder, because now the bishop sacrifice on h6 is not on the cards, right? It's just simply not enough power for white to recapture with the queen on h6 and set that whole complex of ideas in motion. However, it's all water under the bridge. Queen e8 was played. Queen g4, a nasty probing move which forces black to think some more. Of course, now the g7 pawn is pinned, so bishop takes h6 is a direct threat. King f8, sidestepping that pin. And now again a nasty probing move, queen h3. Surely now white is again threatening the bishop sacrifice on h6. Now the queen will recapture on h6 with check. And after the check, the black knight does not have time to jump into d3 or e4, so it would be an immediate mate also. Okay, king g8, sidestepping the check again from h6. And, well, a boxing analogy cannot be passed up here. White has got black on the ropes, but will he go down from all the punches? That is the question. Okay, now Trent played f2, f3. Also in advance already contesting the second blockading square, e4. The other one was already contested with rook d1. So here he played f3. But funnily enough, again, now, in the analysis and in the graph, the engine suggests, because of the peak in the evaluation, that here white could have won with the bishop sacrifice. Again, let's take a look, right? Would it have been more logical or human this time around? Bishop takes. Sorry. Bishop takes. Pawn takes. Queen takes. Knight e4. The same type of defense. f4 with the idea of playing f5, but also bringing in the rook for a possible rover. Queen f8. Hitting the white queen. Don't want to exchange queens. Let's go back. Queen g7. Okay, f5. Knight g5. Hitting my queen again. Don't want to lose the queen. Queen g3. And somewhere around here it normally already gets fuzzy in the head of a human player. Unless your name is Magnus Carlsen, maybe. Okay, it does look very strong right now for white. And yes, is objectively winning. Because these engines, hey, they know what they're talking about. But again, for a human player, this is not so clear. Black is still kicking around on the king side. And white has to play these slower retreating moves with his queen and have faith in his pawn pushes at the same time. And whenever chess switches from clearly seeing what's going on to needing to have faith, it always gets a bit scary. And the human player says, nah, unclear, let's not go there yet. So you'd have to be a super duper strong chess player to calculate all of this and also have very strong faith in Kaisa, our chess goddess, to give you the victory. So yes, again, I can understand White's decision to play quickly and practically and not go for the sacrifice the second time around. With the text move, he has hit the ball back over the net, the text move being f2, f3, of course. And indeed, it is now threatening bishop takes h6 in a more human way, because all the interposing knight moves have now already been taken away in advance. Okay, well, black decides to hop in anyway, and it's virtually the only way to play on now. But now comes an excellent move by Trent. He plays rook takes d3 and decides to sacrifice the exchange. Now, obviously, white did not put the rook on d1 to just simply win a measly pawn by means of bishop takes d3, pawn takes, and rook takes d3. Because now, obviously, he no longer has the beautiful attacking bishop available. And he's just up one pawn. But let's not forget that, hey, black has superb bishops and he may even just regain the exchange immediately. So this is not the way for white to go. It never was the intention for white to go like this. No, rather, he put, of course, the rook on d1 to sacrifice a rook in the corner that was not contributing anything to the attack. And now, after bishop takes d3, let's take stock even a little bit more. If we take a look at this quadrant of the board, the black king side, we see that there are two rather awkward defenders. Better defenders are knights, but there are no knights left anymore. Of course, there is still a quite nice pawn structure in front of the king, but even that pawn structure has been compromised a little bit. Sometimes there are even sacrifices on e6, there are also sacrifices on h6, prying open the king side, and then, well, there will be access towards black's king. But if we also take a look at this position from another angle, another point of view, and we start counting the units, the attacking units, we see that already 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 units can potentially be involved in the attack, and who knows, maybe even a 7th and 8th unit. And well, what does black have to counter that? Basically what's going on here is that white is outnumbering black on the king side, and so that's why this sacrifice is so very strong. Well, maybe one final aspect that I would also like to point out is that all of white's pieces are participating in the attack, and if we compare that with those guys sitting here, they are not participating in the defense of the black king side at all. And these 3 yellow guys over here, they also don't have anything to attack here on white's queen side. And even if they would have been attacking something and they would win 1 or 2 pawns, in the meantime we're checkmating your king, which is 1,000 times more important. Okay, still the game continues, of course. Queen f8, overprotecting h6 after all. But here comes new attacking power, g4. And we want to go g5 and attack the h6 point for the 3rd time. And as mentioned earlier, make use of the h6 pawn, possibly, as a hook for white's rook, opening up the g file, allowing all the pieces to flood in. And finally, now really, because of all the punches and maybe also the slight surprise value of the exchange sacrifice, black really cracks. He shifts now the weakness from h6 to g5 by playing g7 to g5. But he is putting this pawn within the reach of white's f-pawn. And now after bishop g3, all that white needs to do really is play f3, f4, create an immediate pawn lever, open up the f-file and just overrun black. So from now it's all going very, very fast. Queen g7 was played, f4, the attack speeds up. White adds more wood to the fire with almost each and every move. G takes f4 was played, but the reserve pawn just recaptures and again threatens to go forward. Bishop c5. Now you may think, this is still a quite nice move, because maybe the bishop can exchange itself for the knight, and then the knight no longer has influence on the king side, right? Well, I think in the first place the knight is not the most important attacking piece, because the knight has quite short legs, and yes, it does support f4, f5, and it is attacking e6, but I think in this particular position the white is performing more of a positional role. It's just the piece cementing white's position in the center, allowing, let's say, the basis for the other white pieces to attack on the king side. Another very important aspect of this move, this bishop e7, c5, is of course what has changed in the position after this move. Well, when the bishop was still on e7, the bishop was still controlling this square. Now it is no longer. So what does white do? White immediately seizes the opportunity and plays bishop h4, threatening a deadly bishop h6, which would be more or less lights out for black. Black still plays a very cunning move, h5. Of course, he would dream of exchanging queens, you know, when there would no longer be a kingside attack anymore, and he may later on enjoy his extra exchange, rook versus knight in this case. But of course, white wants nothing of it. He blocks the g file. And now after h takes g4, he does not recapture because speed is much more important. The idea was always to bring the bishop to f6 and keep an eye on the h8 square. So queen h4 was played. And here the final crackdown in black's position, f5. Of course, to create space for black's king and queen, but this pawn can be taken en passant. Queen h8, are we still going to exchange queens? No, of course not, says Trent. King f7, am I then maybe finally going to run away towards the queen side? No, says white. Queen h5. Okay, I'm giving up the pawn, but it's much more important to keep the king here on the king side. Queen g5, king f7, and now the important light square bishop has the final say in the game. Bishop g6, again denying the black king access to e8 and further. King g8, and after bishop h5, black resigned because it is mate on the next move. Okay, well, with that we've come to the end of the analysis of this game. I hope you've enjoyed it, learned something. I know I did. What I've learned in particular is that sometimes as a chess player you can be very unpractical when sacrificing material, even though objectively it's the strongest thing to do, because it may ask so much of you as a human being to try and calculate all the complications that it's just simply not the right way to go. It's just very impractical. And you may also give your opponent a chance to come back if you start investing a lot of time. So what I especially like here about White's play is that he played it very quickly and practically with rook d1 and f3, and only then tried to go for more decisive attacking breakthroughs. Yeah, especially for me as a rather perfectionistic player, this is something that I can learn from, to become a more practical player and not try and calculate these sacrifices on h6 till the end, or at least till a certain moment in time where I can realize with my playing strength that I'm probably winning. So yeah, also we've seen some very typical maneuvers and structures again in queen pawns openings. So for you guys and girls out there who play these openings, have them in their repertoire, I think this can be very useful. Well, that's it for me for this time. Call to action. Yes, call to action. Please subscribe, like, and comment. And then we'll see each other hopefully soon again in another video. Thanks. Bye-bye.